One of the programs we started during the pandemic were our mock interviews. If you've spent any time on Albert's list over the past 9 months, these have involved everyone from marketers to accountants, software engineers, designers, new graduates, and more. Spearheading these webinars has been our very own Corey Hiramoto, a Fortune 100 recruiter, and his career coaching business, CareerShakers, which have helped corporate professionals plan out their careers and find their next job. He's spoken at workshops, technology events, radio shows, and has a fabulous YouTube channel, which if you've seen him share his screen during any of these mock interviews, has some really great title cards, where he posts regularly and weekly career content, including the Life Switch podcast, where he interviews entrepreneurs and other professionals who have switched careers. Today, he's here for a special occasion where he'll share the top lessons he's learned from mock interviews he's conducted this year and how job seekers can apply these to be successful in 2021. If you're looking to raise your interview game, this is the place to be. Corey, welcome back. It's good to end the year with you as well as start this pandemic.
Yes, thank you, Albert. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone in the Zoom chat as well as on Facebook. There was a lot of RSVPs, so thanks everyone for joining in. And before I kick off anything on my end, I just want to say thank you to everybody who volunteered this year. I think Albert and I did this since March, so almost 9 months of practice interviews. So huge shout out to everybody that participated and volunteered. I was one of the volunteers one week, and then I interviewed Albert the following week. So yes, it is definitely quite a challenging and fun experience. And so I definitely want to say thank you to everybody who volunteered for learning opportunities for the rest of the community. So we can dive right in. This is like a 2021 interviewing tips / like what we learned from all these Monday night mock interviews. Let's dive on in here. So what am I going to talk about today? Basically, key takeaways, lessons I've learned by doing nearly 9 months of mock interviews with different job titles and industries across the board. I'll also talk about resources. I'll have these sprinkled in throughout of how you can either find advice or get answers to solve certain problems. And then, of course, this is going to be super interactive, so just stop me at any point, use the chat function, or come off mute if you're in Zoom, and let me know how I can help. What can I say except you're welcome? All right, so lesson learned number one, or lessons to be learned. Lesson to learn number one is every single meeting or interaction that you have during an interview process is literally an interview. So even if you're told, oh, you're just going to meet with this person, it's not a real interview, it's just a conversation, or you're going to meet this person for lunch, like, don't worry about it, it's not an interview. Every single interaction you have during the hiring process is literally an interview. They will be assessing you in some form or fashion, so you need to show up prepared, do your research, treat it as an interview, and take it very seriously. Now, how does this apply to the mock interview sessions? Well, there were at least 2 instances where folks who were interested in a certain type of role or working for a certain type of company actually had a recruiter listening in to our Monday night mock interview session. And they sometimes would message them afterwards or put it in the chat like, hey, I'm a recruiter for software engineers at X, Y, and Z company. Like, please send me your resume. So while it was a practice platform for folks to learn more about interviewing, it's also an opportunity for interviewers, recruiters, hiring managers to watch you perform and see if you would be a really good fit for their company. Now, when I think about when I was in college, I was an accounting major, and all of the bigger accounting firms, they have a lot of events on campus. So they have things like resume review workshops and interview practice sessions, just like we were doing here in Albert's list. And most students showed up to those things treating it literally exactly as it was, as either a free resume review or free practice interviews. But in actuality, they were tests. So there was always a campus recruiter there, there was potential partners there, directors there who were doing these interviews. And yes, they are there to help you get better, but they're essentially interviewing you while you're practicing doing an interview. And a lot of the people who did very well on the interview sessions or practice sessions ended up getting internships later on. So everything is an interview, and you should treat it that way and come prepared. Folks who showed up to the resume review session with bad resumes, now that's the company's first impression of you, is that you show up unprepared with a bad resume. Similarly, if you bomb these practice interviews, yes, they are practice and they're not real, but now they have branded you as a person who is very bad at interviewing. And so when you apply for the job formally later on, they'll be like, yeah, Corey's the guy who, bombed all of his practice interviews with us. So I don't really know if I want to interview with him. So treat every meeting as a real interview, and every opportunity or every interaction you have with someone at a company, which means do your research, come prepared. If you're not ready to have a meeting and you're really stressed from work, or you need time to do more research or practice questions, move your meeting. Work with your interviewer or your hiring manager or your recruiter to move your meeting until you are ready and you can make a really good impression. All right, just checking the chat for any questions here. Sorry, I think Zoom shows up as like a white box when I check the Zoom chat on my screen. But let me know if any of you guys have any questions about this first tip. You never know who's going to be watching or listening in whenever you're doing interviews or meeting with people or waiting in the lobby for your interviews. So I would just take that moving into 2021 when we do start to return to office, and hopefully everyone starts applying for jobs again. Yes, that's right, Albert. So practice isn't actually really practice. All right. So lesson learned number 2. Know your FAQs so you can actually score really easy points. So what this means is there's going to be standard questions that you're going to get in every single interview, every single industry, no matter what the job is, right? These are the tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, what is your greatest weakness, where do you see yourself in 5 years? All of these easy like warm up questions is kind of what I call them. You need to have them nailed down pat. If someone asks you, walk me through your resume, you shouldn't have to say, or, oh. Your answer needs to be perfect, like well rehearsed, succinct, within the general time frame of 1 to 2 minutes. Like these are really easy softball warm up questions that you need to nail right off the bat. If you can't answer these easy questions at the beginning of the interview, you're number one setting yourself off on a very bad note, and also the interviewer is now thinking, wow, they can't even answer these easy questions. I wonder how the rest of this interview is going to go. So you're going to want to make sure you know what all of these are. If you don't know what commonly asked interview questions are, not to worry. There's resources here on my YouTube channel. I talk about the different types of interview questions, right? Like the behavioral, the research-based, the hypothetical, the case studies, the brain teasers. That's this very first video right here at the top. And then there's also, I have lots of videos and tips and tricks on how to answer very common interview questions, like what's your greatest weakness and all that different type of stuff. You can also literally just Google common interview questions and then make sure you are practicing all of those so that when it does come time for the interview, you can nail them very, very easily. For any of those folks who like follow basketball, when they talk about like when a shooter or player is getting really hot and warmed up, very, very similar here. So they're going to give you very easy questions for you to kind of get rolling, get going, get into your groove and your natural rhythm, build your confidence. And so if you can nail these FAQs, you'll be on a really strong foot and just flowing through your interview. Resume. Yes, that is definitely true. That is definitely true. Yeah, so you're gonna want to know all of these, like, tell me about yourself, resume questions, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Why'd you leave your last company? All that different type of stuff. The basic questions you're gonna want down. Okay, so, well, Corey, you just talked about the fact that I need to be able to answer all of these commonly asked questions, but how do I actually know if I'm good or not at answering these questions? So you're going to want to essentially know how to practice. I do have another video up on my YouTube channel that talks about this, but I'm going to break it down for you. Essentially, there's probably 3 areas in which you're going to want to focus on when you're practicing by yourself, because you are going to want to build good habits. You don't want to just practice to practice, but essentially like be practicing the wrong things, because then when you actually do interview, it's still not going to go that great. So the 3 areas you're going to want to focus on when you are practicing: number 1, your body language; number 2 is your answers and like what you actually say, aka the words that come out of your mouth; and then number 3 is your timing. So body language, how do you practice this? Number one, I would just say, just like in this picture right here, grab a phone, set it up, film yourself, do 3 to 5 interview questions at once. Don't turn the camera off. Don't reset. Don't be like, oh, I screwed up. Like, let me start all over again. Just do 3 to 5 questions. It doesn't matter if you do good or bad. The reason why you want to do 3 questions is because you want to see how your body language naturally changes as you practice these interviews. So for the very first interview question, you're probably going to start off with really great posture. You're going to be sitting up straight. You're going to, have your hands down and very good. You're not going to be bouncing your legs or shifting around. But after you do your first question and you move into your second question, maybe you have to think a little bit harder, right? Maybe you notice you start to touch your face a little bit. Maybe that's when you start to move around in your chair. So I would do quite a few questions back to back and just see what your nervous tics are so you can start to work and address those. That's how you work on your body language. Number two is your word choice. So that's again why you're filming yourself. So as you practice answering an interview question, play it back and think about, okay, did I ever repeat myself? That's very common for folks when they get a new question that they've never answered before. Sometimes you can talk yourself into a loop by saying the same thing, maybe in different words, or you may add additional words or adjectives or whatever that makes your answer a whole lot longer that you don't actually need because you're kind of just saying the same things over and over again. And you're going to also want to listen to your answer and think to yourself, am I actually answering the question that was asked? Sometimes longer questions or questions with multiple parts can be very tricky to organize with your thoughts, and it may result in like a really jumbled up answer where your thoughts aren't really cohesive and the story isn't easy to follow. So that's another thing that you're going to want to look for when you are practicing. And then lastly, for timing. So for any research-based question, which is like the tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, those should be between 1 and 2 minutes. For any behavioral questions, which is like tell me about a time when you did blah 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 or whatever, right? These are like all your STAR technique questions, or CAR is the other acronym that people use. Those answers should be between 3 and 5 minutes, no less than 3, no more than 5. And then for any hypothetical questions, you're also going to want to be somewhere between that 3 to 5 minute time frame. So again, you're going to want to practice your body language, your word choice, and the content of your answers, and then focus on your timing. If you're too short, you're going to want to add a little bit more, probably focus more on your results and the impact that you have for the company. And then you're also going to want to talk probably a little bit more about your technical skill set or your business acumen. If you're on the longer side, if you're way over 5 minutes, you probably have additional details that aren't really necessary to answering the question or to getting your point across. And then for the result part, you're going to want to focus on like scale, complexity, business impact, things like that, scope of work, that type of stuff. Pauline, how to be confident while interviewing? Ooh, that's a good one. So I think confidence actually comes across in 2 different parts. So number one is actually how you say or deliver your answer, and then number two would be the body language itself. There are some studies that say, body language is like 97% of the interview. Some say it's like 70%. Some say it's like 55%. Either way, body language is still very, very important. So you're going to want to practice all of those things. Now that we are working from home a lot and you're going to be doing a lot of virtual interviews, your interview will actually look a lot like this. So it'll be, basically chest-ish up. So that's really nice because from a body language perspective, you don't have to worry too much about like what your hands are doing, and people can't see your feet. But if you are like bouncing around, like I'm bouncing my feet right now, you can obviously tell that I'm a little bit nervous. And then eye contact is also going to be very important. If you're looking up, typically means that you're thinking, and if you're looking down, it looks like you're really unsure, you're kind of uncomfortable. So you're going to want to make sure you have both good body language as well as eye contact. And then in terms of how you deliver your answers with confidence, I would say try to avoid answering questions with like questions, and like watch the inflection of your voice. Okay, thanks Paige for the question. Can I talk a little bit on what the talent acquisition manager is looking to discover in a phone interview? And yeah, the box is when I'm reading the Zoom chat. Sorry about that, folks, because yeah, it doesn't go into a different place. Okay, let's see. Dun, dun, dun. So what does the recruiter or hiring manager look for or want to discover in a phone interview? So I'll get rid of that box. And again, the box comes up whenever I read the Zoom chat. So sorry about that, folks. So in a phone interview, assuming by phone interview you mean like the general first round interview, typically is what people call the phone interview. So for that one, they're going to be usually assessing your technical skill set or like role related knowledge, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. So if it's a technical interview, you'll probably be doing like a case study or like some type of coding test. If it's, finance or sales, they'll ask you a lot of behavioral questions about your background and experience or projects to see what type of work you've done, trying to assess your scope and see what types of projects you've done and if it's relative to what they're trying to hire for or essentially what the current needs are for that company. And but now that we're all working from home and a lot of these interviews will be essentially on the phone, assuming you're not showing your video, you want to basically focus a lot on your voice, obviously, but your body language does translate to how you come across and sound audibly on the phone. So you're still going to do all of the same general practices that you're going to want to practice for a real in-person interview. So have really good body posture, be cognizant of like what you're looking at, what your hands are doing, try not to bounce around a lot because it will translate over to your voice to make you sound either confident, nervous, unsure, etc. Hopefully that helps, Paige. If you want something more specific in terms of phone interview advice, let me know. I'll check the chat after the next slide. Lesson learned, another one. So know yourself, know thyself. And so what this basically means is you should either ask either a friend or someone in the Alberts List community or a career coach or a recruiter or someone, ask them to take a look at your resume, your background, your LinkedIn, and tell you what your strengths and potential weaknesses are as a candidate as it applies for certain types of roles. So why is this relevant to interviewing? So what I did a lot of the time is I would take a look at both the person's resume as well as the role in which they're applying for, and everyone's got different situations. Sometimes you're applying for a role that you've already done before. Sometimes you're trying to do a career switch, and so you're going to want to talk about how your skills are translatable, right? You're going to want to take a look at your background and understand where your potential weaknesses or gaps may be because you know the interviewer or hiring manager is going to be asking you about these certain gaps or potential weaknesses that they may foresee as weaknesses and have you explain them. So you're going to want to be prepared for those types of objections or questions that you may get, right? So for example, maybe you took a few years off and now you want to come back to work, or maybe you want to move from finance to marketing and people are going to ask you how you're going to be qualified for this type of role, right? Maybe you were laid off at your last company or something like that. So you're going to want to be prepared for all of these different types of questions that you may get so that you can have really good answers ahead of time. And then similarly for the strengths, right? You're going to want to know what makes you unique as a candidate or what makes you special. And that is what I essentially call like your secret sauce. So both on weaknesses but also for strengths, you're going to want to really understand how you are different than every other candidate that's applying for this type of role. And this is really important the higher the role is that you want and the more competitive the company that you want to work for. Now, I'll use like a sales example because everybody knows about sales. So let's say you're applying for a sales role and you believe, and I hear this a lot, you believe that your secret sauce is that you've always been able to hit your quota and you've been to President's Club 2 times in a row. Some people think that that's their secret sauce. Unfortunately, while those are really good accomplishments, those are probably not super unique and special because everybody who's going to be applying for top companies, top jobs, etc., is going to be hitting their quotas or exceeding their quotas. They're going to be in President's Club. It may be this year, it could be last year, right? So a lot of people are already doing those things, and that's what I would call like core responsibilities for the role. So instead, if you were applying for a sales role, maybe your secret sauce is that you have closed the first 7-figure deal for your company ever, or maybe you've been training all of the SDRs on how to source and find new leads and prospects because you were so good at it before. Or maybe you identified a new potential product feature based on feedback from your customers, and then you worked with the PMs as well as the engineering team to build out a brand new product or another feature that has increased revenue, not just for your region or your territory, but across the entire company. Those would be what I would consider to be secret sauces, right? And so think about what your strengths and weaknesses are and be prepared to weave that into your story. Any suggestions for coming up with good examples for tell me about a time? Ah, yes, Michael. Great question. I was literally about to go there on my very next slide. I believe it's my very next slide. Yes, it is my very next slide. So I will get to that one. Paige, thanks for the follow-up question. Phone interviews were generic in nature and not technical. We were wondering if salary was the biggest factor if someone moves to the next round. Oh, okay. So maybe by phone interview, you're referring to the recruiter screen, where you talk with the recruiter. So those typically, yes, are not that technical unless the recruiter actually has that type of background. They wouldn't really be able to fairly assess your technical skill set. So those will be slightly more generic. We'll probably ask you, tell me about your job or what are you doing at X, Y, and Z company? Tell me about your projects, etc. And then we'll see if it matches what the hiring manager is looking for. So we usually won't have a lot of really technical questions, or if we do, it'll be like black and white questions that have clear answers so that we can just figure out, like how good you are in SQL or something like that. You were wondering if salary is the biggest factor if someone moves to the next round. It shouldn't be. So typically, let me go back. So typically, companies should not be rejecting a candidate based on your compensation expectations. I'm not saying that it never happens, but typically that's not a reason to reject someone if they want to make more or sometimes even less money than the role is actually hiring or paying for. So I do not believe it should be a reason as to why someone would not move forward in the hiring process. But let me know if you've heard anything different or anything like that. We've got a lot of participation from folks in Zoom. Thank you very much. Anyone in Facebook, if you guys have questions, guys or gals, let us know as well. I'm checking both. All right, so I believe this is one of my last lessons learned from the Monday night mock interviews. And this is a big one. This is what I call or consider to be answer selection, and this is really important. So what I'm referring to is how do you know which examples to share if you're asked a certain type of interview question? And if you're applying for jobs that you have done in the past that that you're 100% you match the job description and you've literally done this exact job before and you're not getting hired, it's typically because of your answer selection and what you're choosing to highlight during your interviews. That has been the biggest gap that I've seen with a lot of people. So what do I mean by answer selection? You want to make sure that you're choosing an appropriate example that highlights your skill set that's relevant to the role. That's very, very important. That also answers the question. So some things that I have seen during Monday night mock interviews is if I ask you a certain question and you give me a really good answer, but it's not really related to the role, it still unfortunately does not come across very well in an interview. So, for example, if I asked you to tell me about a time, tell me about the most complex problem that you've solved. Let's just pretend you got that question. The question itself is designed to understand what in your role that you've done that is very complex, or like what is the sexiest project essentially that you've done or led. And we really usually want to hear answers that are related to the role itself from a technical perspective. So if it's a finance job, I want to hear about the most complex finance implementation or finance process that you've had to fix or whatever. Now, if the question is, what is the most complex problem you've had to solve? And your answer is about a time when you had to solve a dispute at your office, or like you had a disagreement with your manager or your coworker, even if your answer is worded perfectly and does very and like is a good answer, it's not really what the question is designed to understand, and therefore it is not a good answer, even though it could have been, but in a different context. And so you just want to be very cognizant of the answers in which you're choosing to share in each specific scenario. And as you interview or do more interviews with the same company, you cannot or should not reuse the same example multiple times. I've heard this also is if you've done one interview and someone asks you, tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with a coworker and how you resolved it. And then you give us a certain example. And then let's say the next interviewer gives you the exact same question. A lot of times your instinct is, oh, it's the same question, so I should probably just use the same answer. No, it's usually an error. Like companies wouldn't learn anything by asking you the same question multiple times. So it's usually just actually probably a mix up. So I would say flag it to the interviewer, just say, hey, by the way, the person before you also asked this question. Do you still want me to answer it? I can give a different example, and then just give a different example that way. But I would also flag it because typically that must mean that they've mixed up the questions or someone's probably asking a question that they weren't supposed to. So answer selection, very, very important. And then even from my own experience, so I interviewed for a role and she asked me, tell me about yourself. And I talked a lot about the different projects that I did as a recruiter. So I talked about like process improvements. I talked about, time analysis surveys, generating efficiency for my team, large scale projects, right? And then I asked her, well, what are you looking for in your, like, as you're hiring? And she told me, oh, I just need somebody that's going to hire a lot of people. You won't have time to do projects. So pretty much, I already knew that I was going to get this job because I chose to highlight skills that weren't really relevant of what she's looking for this position. And of course, I didn't get it. But answer selection is super, super important because all of the stuff I was talking about is great work, high impact, very, very powerful examples. But I shared it in the wrong context and I didn't move forward in the process. And so when you are thinking about the best answer to give or the best example, you're going to want to think about multiple factors. So there's four of them that I usually go with. So the first is talking about scope. The second is talking about complexity. The second or the third is about business impact. And then usually the last one is about I guess scale, right? How many people or how many functions, etc., that you were working with. So you're going to want to make sure that you're hitting on the appropriate one of those four to make the best answer possible. So hopefully, Michael, that helps answer your question. I'm going to check the chat one more time. So pardon the white box. It's going to show up here. What if the interviewer asks a behavioral question and the answer doesn't come to mind right away? Yep, very, very possible, especially if you've done, I know some companies make you do like 9 interviews, and so you're definitely going to get questions that you haven't prepared for. Can you ask for time to think about it and move on to the next question? So you can definitely ask for some time to think about it. You can use oh, that's a great question. Can I get a minute to think about it? You can definitely do that. I wouldn't recommend you use that more than once in your interview total, because then it just means you weren't prepared for all of these questions. So you can probably use that once to buy yourself more time. But in actuality, you don't really have a minute, right? So, and don't be silent the whole time. I would start to think out loud. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'm thinking about this time when I did something, something, something. Is that kind of like an answer in which you're looking for? And then you wait for the interviewer to respond, and then they may say yes, and you go, okay, perfect. So then you start to answer your question. But you don't want it to be totally silent. You're going to want to at least think out loud a little bit. But one thing I wouldn't do is just say, oh, I don't know. Can we just skip this and go to the next question? Definitely don't do that at all if possible. Any tips on how to master interviews when transitioning? Since I don't have current experience in the new field and I can only speak about past experiences, class projects, but I have extensive work experience and wouldn't qualify for entry level. Okay, so I love this question. So if you are going to transition careers or change careers, how are you going to master these interviews? So there's actually going to be some pre-work that you're going to need to do before these interviews even start. So the first thing you're going to do is make sure you have a full 100% I would say like 110% understanding of the job itself and the responsibilities. You're going to need to know the day-to-day of the work itself, right? What are the main tools and technologies that you're typically going to be using in this? What are the main skills, languages, tech, etc. that you're going to need to know to be successful? Who are the main stakeholders that you work with all of the time? What are some of the different reports and metrics and KPIs and key success factors for this role? Those are all the different things you're going to need to know, because you can't answer a question as if you worked in a specific role unless you actually know what those things are. You're going to basically need to give the interviewer the confidence that even though on paper you haven't done this job, you actually know how to do it, either through translatable skills or by an extensive amount of research. That's how I made my career transition. I downloaded LinkedIn Recruiter myself. I taught myself how to source. I practiced doing interviewing like imaginary people, like figuring out how am I going to create good interview questions and all that different type of stuff. So you really need to master the role itself in order to figure out what a quote unquote good answer is in your interview. The other piece that you're going to want to do when you're changing careers is you're going to need to get some type of tangible work experience related to a role itself, because you're going to be given or asked a lot of these behavioral questions, right? Like if you want to transition into marketing, there's going to be a lot of questions around marketing, right? So there's going to be, tell me about a time when you created a successful campaign. Tell me about a time when you went over or under budget and how you were able to, recover from that. Tell me about a time when you implemented a marketing campaign or worked with a graphic de- designer and it didn't, go very well, and how you overcame that. So you're going to need multiple examples to pull from that ideally come in work-based scenarios. So you're going to want to either get that experience through your current company or do it on the side or do it for free. You're going to need multiple examples to share in an interview so that you can show them that you've actually done this type of work before. So it is a lot of work, and that's why career changes can be difficult, but they're very rewarding, especially if you don't have to go back to school to do it. Eddie says, could you give a tip for a recent college grad who does not have much work experience but is willing to learn? So if you're asking about an interview tip for a recent college grad that doesn't have much experience, so I would say you're still going to need to figure out what your secret sauce is, right? And what your strengths and weaknesses are and how to essentially overcome them. So when I'm coaching college students, there's really three areas when you're graduating that employers look at: grades, leadership slash volunteer experience, and then your work experience, relevant work experience. That's what we care about. So if you have really good grades, you're going to want to make sure that you're talking about that in your interviews and how you excelled in classes, top of the class, took all these extra courses, et cetera, et cetera. That's relevant to the role itself. Leadership positions, maybe your grades weren't so great and you didn't work too much, but you had leadership positions on campus, right? You were the president of a club, you started your own club, or you volunteered a lot, or something like that, right? You're going to want to talk about all of that stuff and the skills that you've gained, both soft and hard skills, by being in these leadership roles, and also talk about how hard they are to get. Obviously, like becoming president of a club is much more competitive than becoming a treasurer or something like that. And then for work experience, maybe you didn't have the best grades, you didn't volunteer too much, but you worked a lot. Then you're going to want to talk a lot about the relevant skills that you got on those jobs and how they may be applicable to the role itself. So you got to figure out how you're going to kind of weave and tell your story. And then if you don't have any work experience, then I would say you got to start working for free or do the micro internships, do the externships. Check out the video that I have up on my channel about the college tips for students during COVID. Are scale and scope the same thing? So they can be, but how I would define them myself is a little bit different. So for scale, I'm thinking about like how how are you building up a certain project or process to expand across multiple teams or multiple functions or multiple geos, multiple business units or products, etc. That's how I think about scale. And then for scope, I'm thinking about like your scope of work and what you're immediately responsible for, right? Like maybe you are the sales manager for the Americas. That's very different than a sales manager that's applying for the same role, but they manage both the Americas as well as EMEA or APAC, right? Now, scope of work is very, very different. So that's kind of how I would define those two, and then you're going to want to figure out like which one is your strength and which one maybe your weaknesses, or both, and then figuring out how to navigate that during the interview. All right. How can we answer the question on my weaknesses? I got this question office often. What is your weakness? Period. No further explanation on context. Should I find something that is not in the job description? Weakness is weakness. It's obvious, but can that sound good? Yeah. So, is there a way for me to go back on here? I think I can, right? Let me go back. Dun, dun, dun. So I do have this video here, how to answer what is your greatest weakness, but essentially how to do it is you're going to want to pick a weakness that you genuinely have that is not relevant or super important for the role itself. So that's one easy tip there. So let's say you're applying for an entry level accounting role, right? You can say my greatest weakness currently is that I don't have very good presentation skills. I get very, very nervous when I speak in front of large crowds. That's totally fine because as an entry level accountant, you probably won't be speaking in front of lots of people or large crowds leading seminars as an entry level accountant. So it is a valid weakness, but more importantly, after you say that, you need to then show them, not tell them, but show them how you're working on improving that weakness. So for public speaking, you can say, I know that that's a weakness of mine and it's going to be important later on in my career. And so I've signed up and have been going to Toastmasters, which is basically a public speaking seminar or a group that you can go to like get public speaking experience. So it shows them, not just tells them, but shows them you're working on fixing it. That's a much more powerful answer than saying, oh, I know that I'm not good at public speaking, so I'm practicing. Right? You can see how they're very, very different, like the show versus tell. I've learned a few skills like deep learning and other web-based technologies through Coursera. Will that carry value for recruiters in Western countries like Australia? I think that's what it is. I can't speak about hiring practices in Australia, but here in the US, certifications and boot camps, they're all easily accessible for everybody, which is a fantastic thing because you can gain skills very, very easily. Now, from a hiring perspective, you also need to recognize that that's also how we look at it. Anyone can sign up for a boot camp. I know, well, almost anyone, and anyone can take a Coursera course on SQL or Python, whatever. So because they're easily accessible, it's no longer a differentiating factor when you're applying as a candidate. So it is valuable in that you actually learn the, I would say, beginning or entry level skills that you need for a role, but by itself, it is not enough to get a job. You're going to need to couple that with work experience. So again, do an internship, externship, work for free, start your own, do your own projects, etc. So it does carry some value, but it's not going to be the only reason in which you get a job just because you do a course or boot camp or something like that. Does Coursera certificates carry value if there is no work experience, but the candidate is able to build on those skills and showcase side projects? So the side projects is going to need to have some type of like business context, right? So even I've seen this a lot with analysts. You do like an analyst boot camp or you do like a couple Coursera courses and then you go find data online for like COVID results or something and then you do your own analysis of it. That's great, but it's still not as good as if you were to have done freelancing analyst work for a company or a startup or something on the side because you're missing that business context piece of it. And also like when you're thinking about a behavioral example, right, the STAR technique, when you get to the R or the result, all you can talk about is the analysis in which you chose to do on a data set. It wasn't given to you by a client. It wasn't a request for the business. There's no business impact that you would have had with your analysis, and that's why it's not as strong as more relevant work experience, if that makes sense. So side projects are great. I would do the course, do the side projects, and then leverage the side projects to get internships or externships to work for free, then use those work experiences to get a paid opportunity. So you can think about it in like that ladder, if that makes sense. How much of your personality are you trying to show? Is it appropriate to make a joke or lighthearted comment during an interview? So I would, in general, if you're not super like familiar with, I would say, like EQ and social cues and things like that, I would just say steer on the side of caution and just treat an interview as it is. I wouldn't go for any risky joke or something like that. I would just keep it and just treat it as a general interview. Interviews are serious, but they're not meant to be super serious. The best answers or the best way to come across as confident is to have a little bit of fun and to look like you're enjoying it, right? Which means you're going to have to smile a little bit or act a little bit happy. If you're just super serious during the whole interview answering questions, it doesn't look like you're either enjoying yourself or even worse, it doesn't look like you're excited to work there, right? This is my super serious face and it doesn't look like I'm excited about working for you. So you're going to want to balance all of those different factors together. Cool. All right. I think I made it through all those questions. Thanks, guys. This is perfect. Now, last but not least, some resources to help all of you with your upcoming interviews in 2021. BigInterview.com is one I featured earlier. You can it's I think it's an AI bot where you pay a fee and then you practice interviews and then the algorithm gives you feedback about your answers. You can also check out my website and my YouTube channel. It's just CareerShakers. If you are preparing for consulting interviews next year, there is a book that I recommend everybody read. It's called Case in Point. It's very, very cheap. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, anything like that. But if you are going to do consulting interviews, you need to know how to answer a case study. And so that book is going to be super important for you. And then Ambition Box and Glassdoor, both are the same thing. You can get insights about a company culture and things like that. But also more importantly, people can post interview questions that they've gotten during the process. Now, what you should know is for any large company like a Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., there are moderators who will go in on Glassdoor and an Ambition Box and make sure that the real interview questions aren't leaked to the public. So for those larger companies, you probably won't get to really know the exact questions you're going to get for your interview. However, it shouldn't stop you from looking because maybe you'll be checking the website right before the admin takes it down or something like that. And for smaller companies, typically they don't have people scrubbing all the different questions. So you will get a really good insight in terms of either the types of questions or literally the exact questions you're going to get in those interviews. And then you can use those to help practice and prepare. And then, at least for Santa Clara, where Albert and I went to school, you can still access your college career center even as an alumni. So at Santa Clara, there's a career coach for students, and then they have another career coach specifically for alumni. He or she plans alumni events, but as a alumni, I can always go back and do like free resume reviews or like free executive coaching or like free interviews, practice interviews at the career center. So leverage those as well, especially if you paid for tuition for 3 or 4 years. You might as well get your full use out of it. Awesome. Like, there's a couple more questions in the chat while we wrap up. There are different country cultures in the US, and I was wondering if American companies would also give credit for the experience from those companies. What? Let me try to read that again. There are different country culture companies in the US, and I was wondering if American companies would also give a credit for the experience from those companies. For example, Korean based in the US. Oh yeah, I mean, if you're working for a company and like doing work, you definitely get credit for it for sure. Um, as long as you're working, yeah, absolutely. Someone in HR said, how do I scroll up? By seeing how the candidate walks in within 1 minute, they know if the candidate is good or not. Is this true? Speaking from my experience. Um, yeah, is it true? Is it true based on the 1 minute? I think it depends on your company's hiring practice. So at more of the larger companies, they're more data driven, and so just by someone's like first 1 minute of an interview, it's not enough data to make an accurate decision or determination about hiring or not hiring somebody. Not to say that that doesn't influence a interviewer's personal bias on a candidate. It definitely can, but I wouldn't say in general that within 1 minute, even without someone answering a question, you can fairly assess if someone should or should not be hired. And as a lot of companies are focusing on different diversity efforts and the BLM movement, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny in here around interview processes to make sure that they are fair. And so I would probably start to see, actually, if I were to bet, I would just there's going to be a big shift away from people choosing to hire someone based on like initial first impression, especially from legal reasons. You can be in a lot of trouble. Is it possible to share my presentation today? Absolutely. Yes. Work with Albert to make sure people can just get access to my presentation for sure. And I'll also have this recording up on my YouTube channel too, with all of my commentary on top. If a connection tells you about a company's bad history / company culture, should this be taken as a warning sign to not apply for the role as a company? I think it can be, but I think you should also take everything you hear about a company or a manager, etc., with a grain of salt, and do some investigating on yourself. A lot of the company culture is actually dependent on the manager, not so much the company itself. So maybe you would be working for that company, but you'd have a totally different manager. You will have a totally different experience than your friend or connection that may have had a good or bad experience. And it goes both ways, right? If someone tells you a company is amazing, but you don't work for that same manager, you could have a horrible experience at that company. So it goes for both good and bad advice. I would just focus on the questions in which you're going to ask during that interview process. When at the end of the end of the interview, they're like, do you have questions for me? Think about how you're going to want to assess and see if it really is a bad company culture or fit. I wouldn't just take one person's word for it. Any tricks to sound more passionate about certain aspects of my last job? Just to sound passionate in general, smile, like do a half smile, right? You always, like, your voice will even come across as a little bit more upbeat, and your inflection will be a little bit different, as opposed to if I am not smiling. You can already tell that there's a slight change in my voice itself. It does sound a little bit more serious, less passionate. But if I do smile a little bit, even if it's something like really boring to talk about, it's kind of hard to sound uninterested when I have a half smile on. So I would try that little trick. It does feel a little weird in the beginning, but you will get used to it. Let's say design companies, Korean design styles will be different from American companies, even though Korean companies are in the US. Do you think I can still get credit from American companies because it's still work experience? Yes. I mean, I'm not sure like what your definition of credit is, but absolutely. I mean, those are much more specific job related questions though. Like, I can't speak about graphic design and how certain design styles from different countries will or will not be impacted at other companies, but I think it's going to be dependent on the role in which you're applying for. Potentially, let's say you have experience doing Korean style designs, an American company wants to do, open up a Korean style clothing line or graphics, etc., and they may specifically want to hire you for that. So then that could be a really good fit. And then conversely, if you know that you've only worked in Korean styles, then you're going to want to also maybe do some side projects for your portfolio where you've done stuff in American styles, or at least know what the differences are between both, and then be able to explain that to an interviewer and how you can adapt your style for Korean design or American design. Sorry, I'm not super knowledgeable in that space. So if anyone that works in the design community can answer for that, that'd be fantastic.
I also
Albert,
want to mention one more thing, Corey.
yeah,
I don't know that you mentioned it too much. I think that this was a really good measured presentation. And one thing that comes to mind as I go through this whole thing before you promote yourself too, since I've sat in on a lot of these mock interviews with you this year, is that um, people should learn how to promote and flex what they're good at in a strategic manner. I think that's another good lesson for 2021, because I don't know about you, and I think you would probably agree with this, but we've seen a lot of really amazing people this year who are really meek online. and all or over their mock interviews, and they're just they come on these mock interviews and they hide behind their desk, and what I'd love to see from more of the Alberts List community in 2021 is to see themselves show off a little bit more and tell us why they're amazing in a way that doesn't sound like their ego is 10 times too large.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And then if you're wondering, again, like as a listener today, how do I do that? Focus on your strengths and understand your weaknesses, and then understand what your secret sauce is and how you can really stand out amongst everybody else. And I think I just missed one question here. How can you determine whether a company culture is toxic with a specific question? It will take multiple questions, and you should ask different people the same question about the company culture to make sure that it's consistent across everyone else. And it's not just going to be one question or just one person to make an accurate judgment. You're going to want to talk to a lot of different people. One trick that I tell people is when you get the offer, then ask for additional conversations with people so you can have more candid, less formal Q&A sessions to learn about the company. And then the best questions to ask is really for yourself, right? You need to understand what types of company cultures you like and don't like, and then be very specific with your types of questions to see if that's what the company is about. Some people prefer to have managers that quote unquote micromanage because maybe you just like that frame of style, maybe because you don't like having too much ambiguity in your job, and you'd much rather have someone literally tell you every day, like, do this and then do this and then do this. Some people genuinely like that management style, other people hate it. So you're going to want to ask questions around that. So I would figure out what it is that you do or do not like about a company and a culture, and then go that way. And then someone was asking about a CareerShakers breakthrough session. You may have seen that on my website. So if you sign up through my website, what we'll do is you'll send me your resume, and then we'll jump on a quick phone call, 15, 30 minutes, and then I'll just get an assessment of kind of where you're at in your career journey, what it is that you need help with, potential strengths and weaknesses for you overall as a candidate or as a person moving through your career, and then figure out how I can help you, whether that's, through career coaching or changing careers or anything like that.